Poetry is not the proper antithesis to prose, but to science. Poetry is opposed to science, and prose to meter. The proper and immediate object of science is the acquirement or communication of truth. The proper and immediate object of poetry is the communication of immediate pleasure. This definition is useful, but as it would include novels and other works of fiction, which yet we do not call poems, there must be some additional character by which poetry is not only divided from opposites, but likewise distinguished from disparate, though similar, modes of composition. For how is this to be effected? In animated prose, the beauties of nature and the passions and accidents of human nature are often expressed in that natural language which the contemplation of them would suggest to a pure and benevolent mind. Yet still neither we nor the writers call such a work a poem, though no work could deserve that name which did not include all this, together with something else. What is this? It is that pleasurable emotion, that peculiar state and degree of excitement which arises in the poet himself in the act of composition. And in order to understand this, we must combine a more than ordinary sympathy with the objects, emotions, or incidents contemplated by the poet, consequent on a more than common sensibility with a more than ordinary activity of the mind in respect of the fancy and the imagination. Hence is produced a more vivid reflection of the truths of nature and of the human heart, united with a constant activity modifying and correcting these truths by that sort of pleasurable emotion which the exertion of all our faculties gives in a certain degree, but which can only be felt in perfection under the full play of those powers of the mind which are spontaneous rather than voluntary, and in which the effort required bears no proportion to the activity enjoyed. This is the state which permits the production of a highly pleasurable whole, of which each part shall also communicate for itself a distinct and conscious pleasure. And hence arises the definition, which I trust is now intelligible, that poetry, or rather a poem, is a species of composition opposed to science, as having intellectual pleasure for its object and as attaining its end by the use of language natural to us in a state of excitement, but distinguished from other species of composition, not excluded by the former criterion, by permitting a pleasure from the whole consistent with the consciousness of pleasure from the component parts, and the perfection of which is to communicate from each part the greatest immediate pleasure compatible with the largest sum of pleasure on the whole. This, of course, will vary with the different modes of poetry, and that splendor of particular lines which would be worthy of admiration in an impassioned elegy or a short indignant satire would be a blemish and proof of vile taste in a tragedy or an epic poem. It is remarkable, by the way, that Milton, in 3 incidental words, has implied all which for the purposes of more distinct apprehension, which at first must be slow-paced in order to be distinct, I have endeavored to develop in a precise and strictly adequate definition. Speaking of poetry, he says, as in a parenthesis, which is simple, sensuous, passionate. How awful is the power of words, fearful often in their consequences when merely felt, not understood, but most awful when both felt and understood. Had these three words only been properly understood by and present in the minds of general readers, not only almost a library of false poetry would have been either precluded or stillborn, but what is of more consequence, works truly excellent and capable of enlarging the understanding, warming and purifying the heart, and placing in the center of the whole being the germs of noble and manlike actions, would have been the common diet of the intellect instead. For the first condition, simplicity. While on the one hand it distinguishes poetry from the arduous processes of science, laboring towards an end not yet arrived at, and supposes a smooth and finished road on which the reader is to walk onward easily, with streams murmuring by his side, and trees and flowers and human dwellings to make his journey as delightful as the object of it is desirable. Instead of having to toil with the pioneers and painfully make the road on which others are to travel, precludes, on the other hand, every affectation and morbid peculiarity. The second condition, let me just redo that last little bit. Instead of having to toil with the pioneers and painfully make the road on which others are to travel, precludes, on the other hand, every affectation and morbid peculiarity. The second condition, sensuousness, ensures that framework of objectivity, that definiteness and articulation of imagery, and that modification of the images themselves, without which poetry becomes flattened into mere didactics of practice or evaporated into a hazy, unthoughtful daydreaming. And the third condition, passion, provides that neither thought nor imagery shall be simply objective, but that the passio vira of humanity shall warm and animate both. To return, however, to the previous definition, this most general and distinctive character of a poem originates in the poetic genius itself, and through it comprises whatever can with any propriety be called a poem, unless that word be a mere lazy synonym for a composition and meter. It yet becomes a just and not merely discriminative, but full and adequate definition of poetry in its highest and most peculiar sense, only so far as the distinction still results from the poetic genius, which sustains and modifies the emotions, thoughts, and vivid representations of the poem by the energy without effort of the poet's own mind, by the spontaneous activity of his imagination and fancy, and by whatever else with these reveals itself in the balancing and reconciling of opposite or discordant qualities, sameness with difference, a sense of novelty and freshness with old or customary objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, self-possession and judgment with enthusiasm and vehement feeling, and which, while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the images, passions, characters, and incidents of the poem. Doubtless this could not be, but that she turns bodies to the spirit by sublimation strange, as fire converts to fire the things it burns, as we our food into our nature change. From their gross matter she abstracts their forms, and draws a kind of quintessence from things, which to her proper nature she transforms to bear them light on her celestial wings. Thus doth she, when from individual states she doth abstract the universal kinds, which then reclothed in diverse names and fates steal access through our senses and minds. That's Sir John Davies on the immortality of the soul.